Chapter 7. Cupid's Paw. Zack. A high-pitched yelp woke Zack from a state that wasn't quite slumber, but wasn't wakefulness either, making opening his eyes a feat of will. When he finally did, at the second yelp, only darkness filtered into the window blinds of his cramped bedroom. Glancing at the bedside table, he groaned. It wasn't even 5 a.m., thanks to the puppies that the beautiful and ultra-persuasive Linda Christianson had sweet-talked him into keeping. He'd only had his eyes closed for about 2 hours. He'd heard of men losing their minds over women, but he never thought it would happen to him. What a sap. Hopefully she'd bought his spiel about the puppies being good for business. Part of it was true. Once word got out, people probably would come in to see them. He wouldn't even have to talk to them. The puppies could build rapport for him. But the bigger reason he'd taken the puppies was a momentary inability to say no to her, which worried him. He had a practice to build, money to repay, and a life to live far away from this place. Last night, he'd been looking for an extra blanket in the closet when he came upon one of his mother's old sweaters. The smell of her lilac-scented perfume nearly had him on his knees. More yelping pierced his ears. He gripped his pillow, tempted to bury his head beneath it to block out the sound of their cries. It probably wouldn't have done any good. The apartment was a shoebox, and the walls were basically ornamentation separating him from the kitchen a few steps away. Initially last night, he'd placed the dogs in a large medical supplies box he'd cleaned out and lined with paper, throwing in a few socks and a pillow to make it cozier. Apparently, he and the dogs didn't have the same idea of comfort. They'd objected. Profusely pawing at the sides and whining like being confined caused them physical pain. After about 5 minutes, he ditched his homemade crate, put the papers down on the kitchen floor, and erected a barrier to keep them contained, sitting with them until their cries turned to snores. They slept in 2-hour intervals, which should have been okay, given the fact that his residency had prepared him for interrupted sleep. He yawned. Clearly it wasn't. The bedside phone rang. He wiped his eyes and looked at the clock again. Few people had his telephone number. Only one would call at this ungodly hour. "Hello, Father. How's sunny Florida today?" he asked, trying not to sound as tired as he felt. His father was like a bloodhound that could sniff out any weakness, which always led to a conversation more critical than constructive. "Good, you're up. I have a first light tea time and wanted to talk to you about the numbers. They're alarmingly low." Hadn't they just had this conversation yesterday? "Good morning to you, too." "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you needed to be coddled," his father said. Zack bit back a retort. While his father had never been the warm and cuddly sort, he had gotten worse after Zack's mother had died, and despite not being the father Zack had wanted, he hadn't been all bad, teaching him to identify insects and providing him with enough books to be the envy of Alexander Pope, for starters. Though for the most part, his father was a man who moved through the world leveraging the weaknesses of others for his own gain. "Yes, the numbers are down. I'm working on bringing them up," Zack said. "I hope so, because if I don't get my money back this year, I'm tacking on another year," his father snapped. "I'm never agreeing to that." Zack sighed. This year was 1 year too many. By the time he'd started medical school, he'd had no intention of ever coming back. Thankfully, he had a younger cousin finishing his residency who had expressed interest in the family practice. "And I'm not trying to argue with you. I haven't missed a payment yet, have I? So please ease up on the worrying." Perhaps because they'd heard his voice in the bedroom, the puppies yelped more loudly. "What's that noise in the background?" his father asked, disregarding Zack's words. "Noise?" He shifted in the bed and pulled the comforter over his head. The last thing he wanted to do was explain his so-called plan to his father. It was too early in the morning for any of this. But the puppies clearly cared nothing for Zack's desires. Another, louder, longer yelp rang out from the kitchen. Soon all of them were howling. They sounded like a pack of dogs. "I hear dogs in the background. I'm sure of it." Zack threw the covers back. He was a grown man who wasn't about to hide like a child from his father. Besides, he may as well come clean. All his father had to do was make one call to a neighbor on the island to find out the puppies were there. "Someone left a box of puppies on the porch. I'm taking care of them. I actually thought it might drum up some interest in the office." His father scoffed. "You've got dogs in the office. Are you running a kennel or a medical practice?" "They're actually in the apartment at the moment," Zack shot back, knowing the idea of a dog in the living area would offend his father's sensibilities. But his patience had a limit too, especially on so little sleep. "What is this? A joke to you? Are those country bumpkins getting to you? How do you expect to be taken seriously as a doctor if you're running the practice like a farm?" The sarcasm in his father's tone was sharp enough to cut. Zack sighed into the phone. "Wow, Pops, you're on a roll this morning. That's a really nice way to refer to the people you serve for years. And you've got jokes, too." "I wish I were trying to be funny. But I'm being serious, which is what you're supposed to be doing. That and focusing on work." His father paused. "Did I retire too soon?" Maybe he had? Maybe leaving Zack in charge of the practice until his cousin could take over was a huge mistake. Zack scrubbed his hand across his face. He couldn't answer truthfully, so he didn't. A woman spoke in the background. Her words were muffled, but the concern seeped through. More than likely, his new stepmother was reminding his dad about his heart and pleading with him to take it easy. "I can't have this conversation right now, but I really have to wonder why you don't seem to appreciate the work your grandfather and I put into building this practice. A practice from which I am drawing a pension. I expect you to at least make sure that remains consistent. But maybe that's too much to ask. Puppies. Next thing I know, you'll tell me you've got Christmas trees up too. Really?" His father slammed the phone down. Zack looked from the receiver to the clock, unsure how a 5-minute conversation had the same effect on him as standing outside in his birthday suit for a week-long Michigan blizzard. But the scarier thought was how much his father's words had reminded him of himself. Sure, the tones differed, but those words were too close for comfort. Was he like his father? What a bleak thought to start the day with. He hoped he wasn't anything like the man who'd shut down after his mother's passing and only ever seemed to count the angles in any situation. He'd spent so much energy trying to avoid becoming like the man, but he'd followed in his footsteps so far. His father and grandfather had both gone to Morehouse Med. They'd both practiced in Mackinac. And he didn't remember his grandfather well, but he doubted his father's bitterness was entirely the result of his mother's passing. Zack didn't want to inherit that legacy. If he continued to work at Albert Family Practice, there was a good chance he would. A bark pulled Zack out of his unpleasant ruminations. Shrugging back into the Morehouse sweatshirt he'd thrown off during the night, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, stopping abruptly. Cupid sat on the floor staring up at him, one ear up, the other down. Half the tension from Zack's phone call instantly melted. "How'd you get in here?" Cupid lifted a paw and Zack grabbed it. "Are you trying to shake? Come on, smart guy, let's get you fed." Zack scooped him up and padded out to the kitchen. His brother and sister were still secure behind the makeshift fence and wagged their tails as soon as they saw them. He leaned against the doorframe and studied Cupid. "Maybe we should have named you Houdini instead." The other puppies yipped for Zack's attention. "Hello to you, too," he said, unable to help the chuckle that escaped his lips. Their enthusiasm was one of the best good mornings he recalled having in, well, ever, and the perfect antidote to his father's call. "Are you guys hungry?" They couldn't have understood, but the wagging picked up speed. The smallest one wagged so hard she tumbled over, which set her siblings upon her in a wrestling match. "You know, you guys really are cute. I can see why she went all gaga over you." Shaking his head, he stepped over them to the fridge. Linda had warned him they'd wake up seeking food and helped to prepare a gruel last night of kibble, soaked in some milk substitute from the market. According to her, Comet, Cupid, and Donner, of course she had objected to his contest idea and named them all, appeared to be between 5 and 6 weeks old. He drizzled the soupy mixture into their bowls. Watching them skip over was more entertaining than watching television. He grabbed a box of cereal from the cupboard and made himself a cold breakfast, then stood with his back to the counter. The puppies made the funniest noises while they ate. As if sensing Zack's gaze, Cupid stopped licking and peered up at him with clear, observant eyes, then pawed Zack's toe. Zack crouched, giving the little guy a few scratches. They seemed to satisfy him because a few seconds later, he returned his attention to the bowl. Linda had said they were well behaved, which made her think their mother had socialized them. Today, she was going to try to find the dog with the help of a Christmas miracle. He'd never known an adult who actually believed in that stuff and wondered how much of her talk was real, but her sweetness was genuine. And it had touched him enough that he'd promised to go with her. He hadn't even checked his calendar before he'd agreed to go. Now he remembered 2 afternoon appointments. He was seriously slipping. Maybe his father had a point. Even a broken clock was right twice a day. His focus was off. If he really wanted to get out of the long shadow of his father and be his own man, he had to stick to the play, repay his debt, get on his grind, and build up the practice. Maybe this whole thing with the puppies and Melinda was a giant mad dog blunder. Chapter 8: Silly Bulls. Linda eased her snowmobile to the side of the road in front of the doctor's office. She glanced at her wristwatch. It was just shy of 7 a.m. The winter sky held no hint of light apart from a pale crescent moon illuminating the long, snowy path glittering between her and the front door. Apart from the distant sound of waves crashing, stillness enveloped the island, only punctuated by the heavy beats of her heart. In all of yesterday's chaos, she'd forgotten to ask Zack what time she should show up for the new job. Was she ridiculous for arriving this early? Judging from the state of his office yesterday, she couldn't get there soon enough. Organization and paperwork really didn't appear to be Zack's thing. Was that part of the reason patients were going elsewhere? Messy table, messy mind? Was that even the expression? She hitched her oversized canvas tote higher up her shoulder and headed toward the office, loving the sound of snow crunching beneath her boots. Never one to do anything by half measures, she'd tucked a few surprises into the worn old bag. But by the time she reached the front porch of the office, a bout of self-doubt doubled the pace of her already racing heart. Small clouds of white breath tumbled from her lips. How would he react to finding her in his office when he started his day? What if he'd changed his mind? That might be for the best. She still had misgivings about his motives for helping the puppies. Was that why her palms were sweating despite the below-freezing weather? Or was it the fact that she couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with Nova at the cafe yesterday, or the smell of his scarf when she'd walked it over to him? And more than anything, she couldn't get over the way his calm demeanor filled her with a sense of peace. She shook her head, trying to dispel thoughts of the younger man. The reason didn't matter. She was already here, standing at the door, holding the key he'd given her. If he changed his mind, she would come up with another option. Surely someone in town could take the puppies, though she'd already asked all of her brothers and sisters, and everyone was too busy with the farm to care for them during the day. She took a deep breath and opened the door. Excited yelps filled the waiting area. "Wow, you got an early start," she said, sliding the cap from her head and running her fingers through her hair to smooth out the frizzy waves. Sheets of paper scattered atop the counter, and beside the tree made it look like a blizzard had hit. Her heart smiled. In the center of it all hung the ornament she'd given him yesterday. Had he thought about her when he'd placed it on the tree? Ugh, why was she even wondering about such a thing? He shot up from the desk. Both his towering size and appearance struck her in quick succession, sending her pulse skipping, and the answer smacked her in the heart. That calm, assured manner, coupled with the face of an angel, was why her mind kept wandering. In jeans slung low around his hips and a faded sweatshirt, he seemed to have tumbled out of bed and straight downstairs. His thick brown curls stood fuller than normal and wild, like he hadn't stopped to shape his hair or put on any of his professional armor. Raw, unfiltered Zack was a good look, very good. I was trying to get a jump on these files so you wouldn't have to do so much, he said. That was sweet. Here she was, worried he might have changed his mind while he was getting ready to move forward on their deal. She sensed he'd been conflicted, but at the end of the day, he was a man of his word, and that meant a lot. Whether or not he kept the puppies, she would help him. It was the neighborly thing to do, right? Oh, please, you don't need to worry about that. She waved her hand dismissively. Who do you think helps my dad keep the business records? I know my way around an office. I hope you don't mind that I'm here so early. Not at all. I'm glad you came. He glanced down at his hands as if the admission embarrassed him and maybe even irritated him. I mean, I'm an early riser, too. Her jacket suddenly felt like it had just come out of a too-hot oven. She shrugged out of it, hanging it and her scarf on the rack. By the time she'd turned to face him, the puppies were at her ankles playing tug-of-war with the laces on her boots. Talk about adorable distractions. Bending down, she petted and snuggled each puppy, then glanced back up at him. How was the first night? Have you had any coffee yet? I look that bad? Her still frozen lips quirked, and her equally cold cheeks heated. 5 years younger or not, bad would not be the word she'd use to describe Zack Albert's appearance. I was thinking about the time more than anything, that and the fact I'm guessing these cuties probably kept you up last night. That's accurate, he said, a hint of weariness in his voice. She struggled not to laugh. She felt for his exhaustion, yet it lent his voice a mechanical quality that sounded like a cartoon robot. It'll only be for a few weeks. Max, I'm sure they'll be gone by Christmas. I'll make us some coffee, but first things first. Careful to step around the puppies, she crossed the lobby to the reception desk at the end of the room. Pushing a few stacks of paper aside and hoisting her backpack onto the counter, she paused as her gaze swept his face. There was a shadow there that had nothing to do with sleep. What's the matter, Zack? As soon as she'd asked, a sliver of worry cut an icy feeling down her back. How many times had her ex called her pushy for commenting on his emotions before he'd brought them up? Whatever was upsetting Zack was none of her business, but it might help to talk. Talking was the cure-all in her family, so listening and hugs were her default comforting tools. Zack's jaw tightened, and he dragged his hand across the early morning stubble on his chin. His reaction confirmed something wasn't quite right today. She leaned forward, waiting for him to decide whether he would answer honestly or blow her off. I'm no doctor, but sometimes a good chat works wonders. Don't you think? She asked. He hesitated, then shrugged. You're right. His gaze moved to the big picture window facing the street. The gas lamps were on, but all you could see was the silhouette of the town in the distance. It's nothing, really. I got a call from my father this morning. The way his eyes clouded over at the mention of his dad said it all. The call hadn't gone well. Sympathy overwhelmed her, right along with the urge to give him a big hug, but she held back. Oh, what did he say? She asked instead, hoping he didn't feel like she was prying. Just some young old bull stuff. He grabbed a stack of papers, started sorting them into an order that she couldn't make out. A beat passed, and she thought he might say nothing else, even though it was clear there was a lot more to say. Opening up was obviously hard for him, but she wouldn't push. Too much. What kind of young bull? Old bull stuff? She finally asked. There was a distinction between pushing and nudging. He stopped sorting and gave her a long, thoughtful look. For a second, it seemed like he might not answer. You really are a no-walls kind of person, aren't you? She scrunched her nose, unsure if she should be defensive about his comment. She tapped her index finger against her lip as she contemplated her reply. Never really thought about that before. But yeah, walls are for mazes. Life is too short for all that. Besides, too many walls leaves people feeling caged in. She stretched out her arms and exhaled with a smile. He chuckled. Sounds liberating the way you describe it. Maybe you should try it? Or not, no pressure. Her voice was soft, teasing. He smoothed his palm over his curls. They sprang to the side and then fell into a cute part that somehow accentuated his cheekbones. She silently admonished herself for noticing. He wasn't happy about the dogs, and he let me know, which is no surprise, but his disrespect is a lot to take. When my mother died, I think she took some of the best parts of him with her. He never thought he'd have to raise a son alone, and we just don't know how to talk to each other without the conversation ending badly. Oh, Zack, that sucks. No wonder you're upset. I'm so sorry. A memory came to her, and she wondered if she should bring it up now. It seemed relevant but potentially unsettling, and she didn't want to add to his upset. I remember one time when you came to our house after school with Rudy. You were upset because you only got an A- on a project. You said your dad was going to be angry. That was my dad. If you came home with a 95, he'd ask what happened to the other 5 points. Second best was never good enough. He dipped his head slightly, then crossed his arms over his chest. I don't think he knows how to do anything but criticize. Tightness gripped her throat at the thought of Zack growing up with only one model of love and having that model be someone so tough. Do you feel like he's not proud of you? She asked, her voice choked with empathy. His eyebrows raised, then drew together in a sad expression. She bit her lip. Had she said too much? That was another thing that used to make Ryan mad. Her plain-spoken naming of the emotions she saw, or how she pointed out when she noticed someone was upset. He said she didn't know how to deal with men without feminizing them with all of her questions. You really are insightful. Thanks, she said, relieved her probing hadn't put him off. She'd known Dr. Albert Sr. her whole life. He'd been of the community, but not really in it. I think some parents withhold the softer emotions because they want to prepare their kids for a harsh world, she said gently. He arched a brow. You may be right. I don't know. But in his case, his fear of the world has turned him into someone who is always trying to stay one step ahead of the next guy. It's exhausting. I bet it would have been really tough to grow up with someone like that. A slow smile spread across his face. You know, I've never met anyone quite like you. Opening up isn't really my thing at all, but talking to you just feels natural. The patients are going to love you. She blushed to her toes. Considering her past, that was about the best thing he could have said. That means a lot. I'm honored that you trusted me with your feelings. He gave her a half smile that reached deep. Me too. I actually feel better now. A lot better. How about you? How's your day going? When do we get to unpack Melinda Christianson's story? Ha, it's funny. Nova says I've got this 20/20 people vision. But let me tell you, it's always sharper when I'm not the one in the spotlight. Not such a fan of spotlights myself, but is that another way to say you're sorting through your stuff? She gave a small nod. Very good. She ran a hand over the faded tote. It was another carryover from college, downstate. You know, this bag is at least 20 years old. I'm all ears, he said, and she got the impression that he would listen for as long as it took her to tease out her point. And it felt good. She was usually the listener, the advice giver, the helper. It felt nice to flip the script. I've never thought about buying a new one, or a second one to add to my collection. This was enough for me. She gestured with her hand. I'm back home after being away for so many years, and I'm realizing this is enough for me. The silence hung between them for a moment. Her gesture seemed to encompass not just the island, but the room and him, as if to say he was part of all she needed. And that, well, that wasn't what she meant to say, or was it? She avoided his gaze and could feel his eyes on her as she busied herself with the tote. Finally, drawing out a package, she said, "Anyway, I brought you something." The surprised expression on his face instantly lightened the mood. He observed the package, its red wrapping paper giving off a subtle sheen under the office lights. Is that for the Christmas tree? No, Zack. This is for you. Call it a welcome home gift. She set it next to him, then pulled out a bag of ornaments. These are for the Christmas tree." Zack lifted his elbow from the counter between them, where he'd been resting it, and folded his arms over his chest. "Are you always this generous, or is it just this time of year?" "Which answer will get you to tear off the paper?" She laughed. "Fine." He lifted the package, admiring her wrapping job. "It's very neat. Crisp edges and attention to detail." "Thanks. Now open it already." The simplicity of giving always brought her joy. He tucked his finger under one of the flaps on the end and peeled away the gift wrap. A huge grin spread over his face as he drew back the paper. "You got me a scarf?" "Thank you. That's so nice." From the gratitude in his voice, you'd think she was giving him a limb instead of a piece of clothing. It yanked at the center of her heart, made her want to give him more things just to see that boyish smile again. He struggled to accept help, and now the intensity of his appreciation of her gift didn't seem like he and his father were big on tender exchanges. He ran his hands over the forest green fabric. "It's so soft. I'd been meaning to order a new one." "Technically, it's not new. Grandma Shelton." It was one of many extras she'd made just in case. Keeping busy was a family trait, and scarves came in handy during northern Michigan's near-Arctic winters. "I figure anything would be an improvement over that Brillo pad you've got now." Giving her a half grin, he said, "Yeah, by the end of the winter, I'd probably need to prescribe myself medicinal lotion to repair the skin on my neck." Her gaze dropped to his neck, tracing the edges, long and strong like his broad shoulders. She blinked. These weren't the kind of observations she wanted to make about the young Dr. Albert. She handed him the ornaments. "Here, check these out and tell me what you think." He peered into the bag. "Well, I'm not much of an ornament person, but I can see you went traditional. Green, red, and white. I like it." "Good. I thought we could use some stuff from the office to give it a twist. Throw up a stethoscope here or there and turn a few empty pill bottles into ornaments. Over the counter, of course." He laughed, and the shoulders she'd been trying not to admire shook. "Those are great ideas, Linda." "Good. I'm glad you think so." Hearing his tone laced with such vulnerability and sweetness, she couldn't help but think maybe he wasn't such a Grinch after all. He grabbed an ornament from the bag, walked outside of the reception area to stand beside her, and hung the small red bow from a branch. Better already. "It is. But before we hang any more, let's string the lights." "Oh, yeah, it does make sense to put them on first," he said, running his palm over his curls. She tried to ignore the flicker of attraction that bloomed in her chest each time he did that. There was no counter now to act as a barrier, and his appeal felt magnified without it. "Been a while since you've decorated a tree," she teased, trying to calm her nerves with humor. He shot her a wry smile. "What gave me away?" They both laughed, their levity filling the small space. She reached for the string of lights, and so did he. Their fingertips brushed, sending a shockwave of awareness through her body. She swallowed. Did he feel that, too? Again, she was afraid to meet his gaze, afraid of the answers she might find there, but she forced herself to look up and their eyes met. He studied her for a long moment. His heated gaze fell to her lips, lingered on her mouth, then trailed up. Her heart beat wildly as he stared at her, his eyes smoldering with pain, passion, and recognition of the attraction between them. He exhaled, and his brows dipped as he ripped his hand away. "Between the dogs and the decorations, I just might be able to repay the debt that will let me return to Atlanta." "Debt?" she asked, when the word return was what echoed in her ears. He gripped the scarf. "The reason I'm here is to repay my father for 1 year of medical school expenses." Oh, wow. That was another unexpected left. A dizzying heaviness pressed into her lungs. She stepped back, disappointment resting in her gut like an anvil. She wrestled with the feeling, trying to shake it off. It made perfect sense for him to leave. Hadn't she expected he wouldn't be the commitment type? Her eyes drifted to the tree and then the puppies. Of course, she wanted the practice to succeed, but it saddened her to hear that he didn't appreciate the ideas for themselves. This was all just a means to an end and an escape from the island, and to think she'd almost gone against her own little edict and kissed the younger man. She mustered a smile, but he was no fool. The mood had shifted. He slid a large palm down his worn jeans. "I guess I'll go upstairs to get changed and make us some coffee. Will you be okay here with these guys?" The puppies, oblivious to the tension, were back to playing tug-of-war with her laces. These cute, innocent pups were the reason she was here. That and her desire to offer the help she would offer any neighbor in need, especially during the holidays. She pushed aside her silly thoughts about Zack and found her resolve. Yes, I'll be just fine. And she would be. She'd looked into his eyes and gotten her answer. All things considered, it was probably the best one for both of them. Chapter 9, Dr. Oblivious. Zack. It had been 1 week since Linda Christianson had waltzed into Zack's life with her Santa cap, armful of puppies, and talk of Christmas miracles. The office felt completely different. Patient visits had ticked up a bit, and a scent, a sound, an atmosphere existed now that he couldn't quite describe. She'd hung Christmas lights from the trees, brewed gallons of cinnamon tea, and lugged out an old radio, setting it to the local community station, which played holiday songs on an endless repeat. That was until he couldn't take another chipper chorus and curated the ultimate playlist of R&B Christmas music. The look on her face when he gave her the CD wrapped in newspaper was like he'd dropped a lifetime of Christmases in her lap. It made him want to play Santa to her every day. So he'd rolled up his sleeves and cooked a pot of goulash, her favorite, which he looked forward to finishing with her today. The memory of decorating the tree and the flash of desire in her eyes were never far from his mind. Her shuddered reaction when he'd mentioned moving away had bothered him. That morning had also pretty much answered one of his questions about the chef. They were separated, either temporarily or permanently. But they hadn't spoken of that moment, and he hadn't seen that expression in her eyes again. Instead, they'd filled the office with friendly banter. She'd even coaxed him outside to make a snowman one slow day. After they'd outfitted their creation with a stethoscope and lab coat, she took Zack's hand, dragged him to the lake, and playfully tossed him into the fluffy snow on the shore to make snow angels. She hadn't quite convinced him of Christmas magic, but he felt lighter having her around, even if her habit of finishing his sentences still spooked him. She'd taken to adding comedic twists to his unspoken thoughts and lapsing into an imitation of his voice every so often. Yes, she definitely brought something unique to his world, but he'd be hard-pressed to name it. "Here you are." She handed him the folder for Leanne Russell and closed the exam room door behind her. He studied her chart, then smiled at the young patient who'd come in this morning with her mother. "Take a deep breath for me," Zack said, placing the end of his stethoscope against his patient's small, narrow back. "It's cold," she whispered. "Did you bring it in from a snowbank outside?" He chuckled. Only 8 years old, Leanne already had a better sense of humor than many adults. "It'll just be here for a second. 3 quick breaths, and then we're done." She inhaled twice. The third try turned into a cough. Phlegm rattled in her bird-like chest so loudly, Zack was pretty sure he could have heard it without the stethoscope. "Okay, Leanne, we're all set." She pulled her shirt down and looked up at him with her gap-toothed smile. "Why don't you go sit in the lobby while I talk to your mom for a minute?" "Sure," she said, covering her mouth for another cough and closing the door behind her. Zack turned to Leanne's mom, Cheryl. Worry lines etched the young, single mother's forehead. "She's okay, just a little cold. I have some free samples I can send you home with that should clear up her chest in a few days." "Oh, that's such a relief. Money's tight right now." He gave a sheepish grin. According to the intake forms she'd filled out, Cheryl wasn't working at the moment. He had no idea if Leanne's dad was in the picture, but he did know finding work in the winter was tough for people on the island. With the summer tourist season done and dusted, the majority of businesses rolled up their welcome mats. "I hope you find something soon," he blurted with the finesse of a bull in a china shop as he tucked his stethoscope into his pocket. "Thanks. Me too." Cringing inwardly, Zack felt a pang of regret. Bedside manner wasn't a skill he'd picked up with his diploma. A+ in surgery, die in small talk. Linda made dealing with people seem so effortless. He wished she were there now to save him from putting his foot any further into his mouth. The exam room door burst open. "Look, Mom, look!" Leanne stood there, cradling one of the puppies and beaming. He was licking her chin. "Where'd you find a puppy?" Cheryl asked, confused. Zack stepped forward. "They must have woken up. They like to sneak under the reception desk for naps." A giddy Leanne rose on her tiptoes. Her cheeks practically glowed with excitement. "Mama, Ms. Melinda said she's trying to find new homes for these guys. Can we take one? It'd be the best Christmas present ever. And they're free," she said, her voice rising happily on the last word. "I don't think so," Cheryl answered quietly. "Why not? Every girl needs a dog." Leanne was in full salesperson mode. "She'd be good company for me. I could train her and walk her. She would help me be more responsible." Cheryl put her hands on her hips. "Nice try, Slick. Who is going to pay for her dog food and vet bills?" Leanne's smile faltered, and Zack's stomach tensed. Having to say no to her excitement on account of money seemed too adult a reality to face, even for a child as precocious as Leanne. "Oh," Leanne said, understanding dawning. "I see." She kissed the puppy on her head. "Sorry, Mom. I didn't think about that." Cheryl gave her daughter a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe next Christmas. Okay, sweetie?" "That'd be good, Mom. Honestly, it's fine. I'm sure Comet will find a nice home. She's a good girl." The child was obviously trying to be strong for her mother. Watching the wilted child leave the room churned his stomach. "She's an awfully cute puppy, Doc. I wish I could have said yes." A note of apology lined the woman's voice. He got the impression she felt like her poverty meant she was failing her child. "I'm sorry for creating this situation," he said, and the weight of his blunder sat on his shoulders as he followed Cheryl from the exam room into the lobby where he saw them out. Once the front door shut behind them, Zack walked over to the reception desk and propped his elbow on the counter. The entire paper-free surface glistened, thanks to Linda. She looked up at him with a smile. "Has Comet found a home?" He shook his head and told her about the conversation between mother and daughter. "Sometimes I feel like I just don't get it, like I'm tone deaf to the realities right in front of me. Here I am offering things that cost, to people already stretched thin. I swear, sometimes I feel like I need to put a sign out. Dr. Albert, specialty, awkward situations." Linda chuckled softly, those big blues brimming with understanding. "Don't worry, Dr. Oblivious." The joking nickname eased some of the tightness in his chest. "Nobody who winters here breaks that easily," she said, her voice teasing but firm. "You know, you lived here for years. It takes grit to survive year-round on this island." "Tell me about it. My biceps were built by Snowstorm Survival 101. He smiled crookedly, even though hers was a layered statement, considering they both knew he was looking to leave. But at the same time, growing up here had equipped him with a certain undeniable strength. How many days had he spent cut off from the mainland during a blizzard in sub-zero temperatures? When the Straits of Mackinac froze over, the only way on or off the island was by plane or snowmobile over the ice. As a kid, when supplies had run short, he'd made that trek on more than one occasion. "We don't cry when we fall or when we don't get what we want," she said, "mostly because we know what is meant to be for us, will be. You're all good." He could relate to what she was saying. "Ice in our veins and all that jazz," he said. "You got it." She tilted her chin to the side, and the fuzzy white ball of the Santa hat bounced against her smiling cheek. "Plus, I seem to recall the puppy brigade being my idea." "Yeah, you do have a point there." He arched a brow. I should be pointing the finger at you, not myself. She held up her hand. Not so fast, Buster. Let's not forget free will is a real thing. Is it? He'd wondered a few times since meeting her. This woman could have talked him into believing pumpkin pie made sense. Okay, that might be getting a little carried away. He shook his head. An idea sparked. I wonder if she'd be interested in the receptionist position. I can't expect you to stick around forever, he said. She looked so pretty as she pondered his comment. Can you afford to give it to her? He hesitated. Not really, but his financial tightrope wasn't a topic of conversation he wanted to discuss. I'm not sure, he said. I am, she said with gentle certainty. You'd be taking food out of your own mouth to put into hers. Her words came without censure. Somehow he had a feeling she and her family had done that too many times to count. He was silent for a moment, punching numbers on his mental calculator. I have some savings. I could offer her 1 day a week, maybe 2. Linda didn't push any harder, which was a first. He eyed her curiously. Are you trying to give me space to think? She smiled. You're leveling up on your people reading, I see. With you, it's not that hard to tell. Usually you don't hold back. Her brows dipped and her cheeks flushed. She opened the manila folder in her hand, then closed it, then opened it again. Crap. Had he heard her? Lord, he really needed to figure out how to read the room. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. Warmth flowed from her soft skin up his arm and straight into the middle of his chest. It was like standing before a fireplace after coming in from the biting cold, and he wanted to stay there, in that moment until summer, at least. But he withdrew quickly, though not before catching that familiar spark in her eyes, a mirror of their previous encounter that had all the hallmarks of a pre-kiss moment. I like that about you, he said, trying to recover. People pay for insight like yours. I mean, where would the president be without a cabinet? She cocked her head, that teasing glint back. Did you just liken yourself to the man in the Oval Office? He pursed his lips and looked at the ceiling. Okay, maybe I oversold that part. He smiled. My point is, your vision is beyond 20/20 when it comes to seeing people, and that's gold. She pressed her lips together, and her eyes shimmered. Thank you, Zack. I can't tell you how many times people have called me bossy or pushy. Pushy? Anger flashed inside him. Pushy people were manipulators out to advance their own agenda, like his father. She was the furthest thing from that. Who could confuse the two? I think some people misuse that word. You're smart. You see things that most people miss, and you're kind enough to share with them. Next time someone says anything like that to you, send them to me. She smirked. Deal. I'll handle Christmas questions, and you handle all implications that I am a pushy woman. Exactly. She leaned forward, and for a second he thought they were going to return to their kiss prelude, but she drummed her index finger to her pert little chin, and her demeanor shifted. A mischievous grin lifted her cheeks. Okay, since I have the all clear, why do you think Leanne struck such a chord with you? His eyes widened a bit. The question had caught him off guard. In a refreshing way, he hadn't been blowing smoke. He genuinely appreciated how Linda always challenged him to dig deeper, to evolve. I can't quite put my finger on it. He adjusted one of the pill bottle ornaments she'd hung on the tree that didn't need adjusting. There was more behind his urge to help Cheryl and Leanne Russell. What? He couldn't say. Is now a good time to review these refill requests? She asked. Sometimes answers like that come while you're doing other things. Sure. He took the small stack of papers, grateful to her for giving him a distraction. The child had looked so happy when she'd held that puppy and crushed when her mother had said no. Yet he was as powerless to explain exactly why he wanted to help them as he was to label the shift in atmosphere since Linda's arrival. He was tapping the pen on one of the rec sheets and staring into space when the door to the front office opened a few minutes later. Cheryl Russell walked back in. Zack set down the prescriptions. "Hello, Cheryl." Her eyes held determination. "Hey, Doc, I was thinking since I'm not working, right now might be the perfect point in our lives to take on a puppy. I'll have more time during the day to spend with him on training, and I've got 100 applications out. Something is going to come through." He admired the woman's faith, and Linda's counsel at the forefront of his mind. He chose his next words with care. "I know you're shooting for something full-time, but I could use someone to work here 2 days a week. I can pay you an hourly wage and a bag of puppy food a week." Cheryl's fingers flew to her lips for 1 second before they settled back on her hips. "That sounds real good, Doc. Real good." He blew out a relieved breath. This had gone much better than their first conversation. She looked down at the puppy, whose gaze was fixed on her. "You've just found a home, my little furry friend." Comet wagged her tail. "We can keep her? We can keep her!" Leanne squealed and burst from behind her nodding mother. The girl pressed her nose against the puppy's. "I'll take such good care of you. We're gonna be best friends." She'd been so quiet, hovering behind her mother's puffy jacket, but now the intensity of Leanne's unabashed happiness filled the room, melding with that other sensation Zack had been hard-pressed to describe earlier. "One new home, 2 more to find," Linda said, radiant. Her smiling eyes met Zack's. The description Zack had been searching for finally came to him. Joy. He'd felt cheer within 2 minutes of her presence that first day at the cafe. Playful delight when they'd frolicked in the snow. Hilarity when she called him on his seriousness. He couldn't remember an experience with Vanessa that even came close. Until now, he hadn't known that happiness had so many contours. But after this short time in her presence, he realized it did, and that without a doubt, there were infinitely more varieties. Too bad he was leaving. 30 minutes later, after Linda closed the door behind mother and daughter, Zack stuffed Cheryl's employment paperwork into a file Linda had created. "That worked out well," he said. "I don't know how to thank you for being such a miracle worker." "Actually, I can think of something." A hint of mischief colored her voice. "Oh, really? This should be interesting." She adjusted the Santa cap on her head. "I could use some help making ornaments at the children's home on the mainland this Saturday." He laughed and narrowed his eyes. "That sounds oddly specific." He crossed his arms over his chest. "How long have you been working up to asking me?" She feigned innocence with that smile that never failed to undo him. "What kind of woman do you take me for?" No, don't answer. I don't want to know. Just tell me, is that a yes?" "What kind of man would I be to say no?" He smiled, but inside a twinge of discomfort pricked him. Saying yes to her was too easy, and each one would make the upcoming goodbye that much more complicated. Chapter 10. Hint of Home. Linda. Hands full of crafts, Linda sidled past Zack, whose arms were also full, as he held the open door of St. Ignace's Ark Home for Children. Laughter rang throughout the aging Victorian. It was a welcome break from the brisk November wind outside, and the warmth that accompanied it reminded her why she'd always enjoyed coming here each year to make Christmas decorations with the kids. This was another thing she'd missed all those years she hadn't been able to make it back. Her mom, grandmother, and sisters came here pretty regularly, but this time of year they went in shifts, so the farm always had hands on deck to help out with trees. She was excited to share this experience with Zack. It'd be good for him to get away from the office for the day, and the fact that she'd almost convinced him to don a Santa cap on the way over was the icing on the cake. "I think we can put these here for now," she said to Zack, standing beside her in the foyer. "Works for me." His heavy brows arched in quick humor, and he set his bin down on top of hers. He slid his crimson beanie from his head, revealing tousled curls with that full wildness she'd seen that first morning, the day he'd tumbled out of bed and into the office. The same thrill coursed through her at seeing the normally staid man a little loose. "So what's next, boss?" he asked. "Boss? Careful there, I could get used to that." Linda shot back, trying to cover that uncomfortable heat in her belly with humor. He flashed her a lopsided grin, and her pulse skittered. She looked away. Their flirting had increased in proportion to the time they spent together, and younger man or not, each day it got harder to persuade herself that he was off limits. As Linda was unbuttoning her coat, she spotted Stella Suarez. It was a comfort to see that she was still there, carrying on her mother's work of providing a safe haven for kids in transition. The raven-haired beauty glanced over from a desk where she was talking to a teen boy and greeted them with a smile. "Hi, Melinda, it's great to see you." She breezed toward them with her arms wide open and quickly embraced Linda before turning to Zack. "And I see you've brought a friend." Linda stifled a laugh at the obvious admiration in the woman's eyes as she took in the handsome doctor. It seemed Zack's looks weren't just traffic stopping, they were jaw-dropping. And once folks got wind of that title, game over. "Yes, this is Dr. Zack Albert," Linda introduced with a smirk. He never seemed to pay any attention to the drool. She liked that about him, so different from her ex, who'd practically taken out a second mortgage just to ensure the restaurant had a see-through kitchen. Couldn't disappoint his ogling fan club. "Doc Albert's son?" Stella's question yanked Linda back to the here and now. It surprised her to hear Stella make the link. She'd forgotten that people once came from the mainland to be treated by Zack's dad. "Yeah, that's me," Zack replied, peeling off his gloves for a handshake. "Just Zack is fine, though." She could see in his eyes that his thoughts had wandered down the same path. Dwindling numbers never seemed to be far from his mind. "What a pleasure. We are so glad to have you, aren't we, Mark?" Stella motioned for the teen she'd been speaking with to come say hello. Mark hesitated before approaching, and his eyes barely left the floor as he covered the few steps from the desk to the front door. The home wasn't very large, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in love. You could see it shining in all the art adorning the walls and the children's faces. For some of them, this was the first experience they'd ever had of family. Linda wondered if that had something to do with Mark's shyness. Once he joined their little circle, he said nothing. "We call him our resident strong silent guy," Stella said. "He likes to work with his hands." "Is that so?" Zack asked, genuine interest coloring his voice. The boy's presence seemed to extinguish Zack's thoughts about the practice. "Me too." Mark glanced up from the tops of his worn sneakers. Caution beyond his years shadowed his eyes. "Yeah?" His expression squeezed Linda's heart. At a glance, she could tell the kid was hungry for a solid male role model, and his hunger displeased him. "I mean, I just do model sailboats, nothing fancy." Linda smiled. Talk about guided steps. She remembered the summers Zack and her brother had spent out in the barn working on models. He glanced over at her, and when their eyes met, the nostalgic glint in his hinted he'd been revisiting similar memories. "I think models are incredibly dope," Zack said. "Excellent. Why don't we all go into the arts and crafts area, aka dining room, and talk some more?" Stella pointed to a nearby room. Linda nodded. "That sounds like a great idea." Then a smile spread. "Oh, I brought a surprise too." "No, don't tell me it's one of your cherry pies." Stella pressed her hands to her navel. "Okay, I won't then." Linda bit her lip to keep from smiling. Stella leaned toward Zack, and her eyes practically rolled to the back of her head. "Wait, you're not salivating? Have you never tasted this woman's pies?" He shoved his hands in his back pockets, and his smile deepened. "I have not. Sounds like someone's been holding out." "Ooh, chile, let me tell you. You've heard the expression, smack your mama good." "That delicious?" His eyes sparkled. "Better." Stella clapped. He fixed those smoky browns on Linda, and her heart melted. "Is there anything you can't do?" Her cheeks flushed with a mix of pride and surprise. She hadn't expected the praise, and it felt good coming from Zack. For a moment, amidst the laughter and conversation, she let herself wonder what it would be like to really let her guard down with this man. 20 minutes later, Stella had excused herself to handle some paperwork, leaving Zack, Linda, and about 15 kids to sit around the table. The pie was still warm, and Stella had added fresh-churned vanilla ice cream, donated by a nearby dairy farmer. Sugared laughter and chatter had the walls vibrating as the group turned pine cones into elves, Santas, and reindeer. Zack sat across the table, and Mark hadn't left his side. He'd shown him a sailboat prominently displayed on one of the bookshelves flanking the wall and explained that he'd made it. "Impressive craftsmanship and attention to detail," Zack said. "I take it you really like boats." "I do. Do you?" Mark asked. Zack nodded. "Yeah, I used to. It's been a while since I've been on one." Wistfulness marked his voice, and Linda made a mental note to follow up. "But when I was a kid, a man on our island let me help him build a sailboat." Linda smiled. He was talking about old Nate. He'd imparted his love of boats to just about any kid on island who seemed receptive. "Yeah?" Mark asked. The wonder in his eyes gripped Linda's heart. "My dad used to build houses. He always said a man who can put a roof over his head never has to worry about where he's going to sleep. He can make his own home anywhere." Home. Such a loaded word. Having one or a safe place to sleep was something a lot of people took for granted, and it hurt her heart that Mark wasn't one of them. In Miami, she'd had a safe place to sleep, but being away from her family had made it hard to feel at home. That place where the heart finds its rhythm. Hopefully, Mark would at least find connection here, at the Ark. Chosen family that could give him a sense of belonging wherever life took him. "Your dad sounds like a wise man," Linda said. Mark smiled. "Yeah, he was." "I think I have some old saws and mallets in the shed. I'll drop 'em by next week so you can practice. Maybe Miss Stella will let me teach a small workshop." A tear nearly sprang to Linda's eye. She had to take a bite of pie to swallow back her emotions. "Really?" Mark asked, beaming. Zack nodded. "It'd be fun." "She'd probably love that," Linda said, setting down her spoon. A gleam entered Zack's eye. "Great, I could use an assistant." She arched her brow. "Oh, really now? And here I thought I'd graduated to boss?" she teased. "I have an idea," Mark said. "You guys can have a decorating contest to see who can make the best pine cone sleigh, and the winner gets to be in charge." "Oh, I like that," an energetic young redhead said. Linda's brow crinkled. She picked up a nearby pine cone and turned it in her hand. She liked to think of herself as creative, but transforming the woody fruit into a sleigh seemed like a tall order. Zack smirked. "I don't know. Are you ready to take on a former model builder? That could be some stiff competition." Linda looked from his smirk to the eager faces of the girls flanking her. Their chins were bobbing up and down. Following their excitement and unable to resist the smirk still tugging Zack's lips, she squared her shoulders. "All right, it's on." When the timer went off, her biggest accomplishment seemed to be covering herself in glitter, whereas Zack had not only managed to whittle his pine cones into a masterful sleigh, he'd had the ingenious idea of affixing acorns to the top of several cones and piping to their ears for the end result of a sleigh drawn by Rudolph and his entourage. The children's faces lit up with joy, and before they knew it, Linda had promised to come back next weekend as Zack's assistant. Outside, the world had transformed into a winter wonderland, with snowflakes painting everything white. By the time they reached the car she had reserved for off-island visits, a thick blanket of snow covered everything, including both of their heads. Zack grabbed the car door for her. "Here," he said, holding out his sleigh with a mix of shyness and pride that reminded her a little of Mark. "For me?" He just shrugged, a soft smile playing on those two perfect lips. "This is really good, Zack. I'm going to cherish it." It was inspired by the most beautiful snow woman I've ever seen. She tried to laugh off the compliment, but the flutters of her heart posed a challenge. This man was so much, and in the most unexpected ways. His innate kindness with the kids, the warmth of his words, and a million other things were swiftly thawing all of her walls. and as she looked up into his smiling face, snowflakes catching on his long, dark lashes, she couldn't help but feel a hint of home with him. Chapter 11. Snowy Owl. Linda. Sun glinted off the snow, and the branches of the towering pines creaked. Linda slipped her glove through the strap of her cross-country ski pole, then waited for Nova to do the same. Inhaling a breath full of the cold, crisp air, she smiled, and together they pushed off into the ethereal beauty of the frozen forest. With her time being divided between the farm, Zack, and the puppies, it had been days since they'd been able to get out on the trails. "God, I've missed this," she said, gliding through the unspoiled powder. "Me too," Nova replied. Poles clacking, skis swishing, and wind hissing through the glittering branches created a rhythm that swung into full-blown song when the trail dipped. The endless lake came into view, so vast it looked like an ocean. Waves beat the rocky shore on this side of the island, and Linda lost herself in their steady thrum. Her skis allowed her to cover far greater distances than she would be able to on foot or snowshoes, and they quickly arrived at the frozen bay where men were already starting to set up their fishing shanties. In a month or so, the ice would stretch all the way to the mainland, and her brothers would use discarded Christmas trees to mark the 3-mile ice bridge that kept the island connected when the ferries were slow to come. "Wow, your stride is really strong today," Nova said, thrusting her pole into the snow again and again. "I'm barely keeping up. You're floating." "I don't know. I guess I just missed being out here. I'm not used to spending so much time indoors and sitting at a desk this time of year." "Yeah, I've been meaning to ask how that's going," Nova said, her tone curious. Linda thought about the conversation she'd had with Zack a few days ago, where he'd dispelled all notions of her being a pushy woman. Since then, she'd been feeling lighter than normal, which was saying quite a bit since she was basically a total optimist, and their trip to the Ark had taken her even higher. "It's going well. I enjoy being there more than I thought." "Oh yeah?" Nova waggled her eyebrows suggestively. "Do tell. I could use a little spice in my life." "It's not like that. I enjoy being around the patients, being able to encourage them or greet them with a friendly smile. Lots of people are really nervous when they go for a doctor's visit. I feel like I'm making a difference." "Aw, that's so you. But you can't tell me Dr. Hottie doesn't make everything a little more fun. Too bad he's leaving." Linda's stride nearly came to a halt. "How did you know?" Nova's expression fell. "I'm sorry. I thought everyone knew. He's been pretty open about it with his patients, and I hear everything at the cafe." "Yeah, I guess so." Linda's voice fell. Somehow she'd hoped he'd change his mind. Learning that the generally tight-lipped man had shared his plans with others made staying seem a lot less likely. "Well, maybe we can get him to reconsider. It'd be good to have him here permanently." Linda didn't reply, but her heart agreed with Nova. She picked up her speed again, and as they rounded a trail, a majestic silhouette on a pine branch caught Linda's eye. Drawing nearer, she saw that it was a snowy owl. The bird's brilliant white feathers were a startling contrast to the tree's deep green branches. "You see that?" she whispered to Nova. "Wow, that's rare. They don't usually come this far south unless food is scarce in the Arctic." Mesmerized, Linda watched the owl. "They're migratory, aren't they?" Nova nodded. "Yep, the rolling stones of the bird world. They just kind of go where the wind takes them." Linda's thoughts drifted to Zack. "Sounds like some people. Always moving, never settling." She sighed out a cloud of breath. If that wasn't a sign? "It was good to see you," Linda called, her voice carrying over the hum of the snowmobile engines. Multicolored Christmas lights from the surrounding fir trees glowed red and green on the fresh snowflakes, landing on her gloves, twinkling like tiny jewels in the crisp night air. "Thanks again, Linda. We can't wait to get her home. Mrs. Henderson called back, her breath visible in the cold as she nestled closer to her son, seated in front of her on the snowmobile. Her husband and daughter, sitting snugly on a second snowmobile, waved energetically, their family tree secured to the sled behind them. The farm, blanketed in a layer of fresh snow, sparkled, and the pine-scented air was filled with the sounds of laughter as families selected their trees. Linda pointed to the tree on the Henderson sled. "Don't forget to send us pictures when she's all ready. We'll add it to the board." The Christiansons proudly displayed photos of all the trees once they were dressed in all their glory. After about 5 years of caring for the trees, shearing them, trimming them, and watching them grow, seeing the trees find their holiday home was a sweet reward. "Oh, don't you worry, I can't wait to show her off." She watched them ride away, wondering what Mrs. Henderson would do with her tree this year. Every year she picked a new theme. Linda's favorite had been the candy cane tree, using red and white ribbon and shiny silver ornaments. A twinge of sadness stroked her heart. She couldn't help but wonder when she would follow in her tree's steps, find a home of her own, make a family. "I guess I'm in the right place." The man's voice was low and smooth. She spun around, her heart lifting when she saw Zack smiling at her. Bundled up and wearing the scarf she'd given him, he looked like a hot snowman. "Hey, what a pleasant surprise. Welcome to Santa's greenhouse, or welcome back, I should say." "Thanks, this place is amazing. The lights, the music, and I see there's no shortage of Santa hats." He pointed to her brother, Don, who was helping another family load a tree onto their sled. "'Tis the season," she said. "So, to what do I owe the honor? Are you here for a tree?" She was teasing as he kept telling her there wasn't enough space in the cramped apartment above the medical office for one. "I am. A little birdie convinced me Christmas wasn't Christmas without one," he said. "Wow, that must be some birdie to have convinced the Grinch himself." He put his hand to his heart. "I'm not a Grinch. Take that back." "I take it back. You aren't a Grinch. A Grinch wouldn't have rescued 3 stray puppies, or volunteered to teach a workshop at the Ark, or—" "Thank you," he said, holding up his hand. "I don't want you to run out of things to say so soon. We both realize maybe you were right after all." "Not a chance. Now let's get you some candy cane cocoa and find you a tree," she said, motioning for him to follow. "Say what? Is that Cafe Joy candy cane cocoa?" "The one and only. If I'd known that, I would have been here sooner." She laughed and led him to Santa's workshop in the old barn. They weaved around trees decorated in every color combination. She squeezed between a life-size snowman and woman, stopping at the cocoa carafe. "Wow, I thought Cafe Joy was lively," he said, turning around in a circle to look at everything. The amazed expression on his normally serious face nearly made her double over in laughter. She wasn't immune to the charms of the barn, not by a long shot, but seeing it through the eyes of others always delighted her. Seeing it through his eyes was even more exquisite. A little boy swiped at one of the inflatable 8-foot-tall candy canes and devolved into peals of laughter. His pitch increased with each second. His mother tried to shush him, then looked up apologetically. "I'm so sorry. He loves candy canes, and seeing this big one is like a dream come true." "The seed for humanity's belief in miracles," Zack whispered to Linda before turning back to the child's mother. "I get it. I have a sweet tooth myself. Is it okay if I give him one?" He pointed to the dish on top of a reindeer head. She laughed. "I didn't even see that candy. Thank you." Zack squatted in front of the child. "Hey, look what I have." He waved the candy, and the child's eyes rounded. His squeals rolled into laughter. "Do you want this?" The little boy nodded. "All yours." How good he was with kids struck her again, and a small yearning flickered in her heart. "He's leaving," she reminded herself. "Thank you so much," the mother said. "You're great with kids. How old are yours?" "Oh, I don't have any yet." "Well, you'll be a great dad. I can tell. Come on, Malik." She gently nudged her child along. "She's right," Linda said. You really are good with kids. I've noticed that in the practice and at the Ark." He smiled. "I like kids. One day I'd like to have a family as big as yours." "Really?" The more she learned of him, the more she found they had in common. "Yeah, but I'll be happy with whatever I end up with." Seeing the earnestness in his face, Linda remembered Nova's words. Was there a chance he would reconsider staying? And did she want to be the one to try to persuade him? She thought back to the owl. Migratory patterns aside, local lore said that seeing a snowy owl in winter was good luck. Emboldened by the realization, she turned to Zack. "So tell me, Doctor, why are you so intent on leaving Mackinac Island?" The shadow that flit across his eyes made her wish more than anything she could take back her question, but it was too late. Chapter 12. The Perfect Gift. Zack. Christmas music filtered in through the frosted window panes, coaxing Zack's attention away from his computer screen. Outside, velvety darkness covered the sky. A few stars glowed like diamonds. It had been a long day. Linda's absence was palpable, the air devoid of her laughter and cheer. Each person who walked through the door mentioned that the weekly Christmas tree lighting ceremony was set for tonight. He knew without asking that she'd be there. No way would she miss the ceremony. It was everything she loved. There would also be a Christmas bazaar, caroling, and loads of hot cocoa. He stood from the desk, raised his arms above his head, and stretched. He'd been wanting to pick something up for her as a gesture of thanks for the scarf and helping in the office. After their awkward conversation last night, it seemed even more important. Why was he so intent on leaving Mackinac? The answer made perfect sense in his mind, but spoken aloud and to her, it sounded like an indictment on the island she loved with all of her heart. "There's no future for me on this island," he'd said. On Mackinac, he felt forced to live with the ghosts of his past, though truthfully, since she'd come into his life, everything felt different. The pain that once met him at every corner had receded into the shadows so deeply, there were whole days he forgot about it entirely. Now, when he went to Cafe Joy, he knew all the retirees by name. He'd even played a couple of rounds of cards with Fred, Vera, and the gang on his slow afternoons. The other morning, Linda's grandmother had dropped off some hand-knit socks lined with soft sherpa, which helped considerably with the cold. He brushed his palm over his curls. With so many shops closed this time of year, tonight's bazaar would be a perfect opportunity to find a unique trinket to help smooth things over. After tucking the puppies away in the kitchen with their toys, he pulled on his coat and wrapped the scarf she had given him around his neck. The fabric was so much softer than the expensive one he'd ended up giving the puppies as a tug rope. Cupid stopped chewing his toy to watch Zack open the door. "Don't worry, I'll be back soon," he said before closing it. Snowflakes drifted down as he made his way to the square. Main Street basked in the warm golden glow from the vintage gas lamps, stars overhead and a scattering of storefronts casting cozy light on the quaint downtown. He strode with the confidence earned from weeks without a single slip on the black ice, a small half grin playing on his lips. As he drew nearer the tree, he was surprised by the number of people surrounding it. Everyone on the island seemed to have come out. He scanned the clusters of people huddled together, most engaged in spirited discussion. There was only one person he cared about seeing. He heard her before he saw her. Lilting laughter carried from the porch in front of Cafe Joy. Linda stood in a circle of men and women. She tossed her dark tresses over her shoulder and laughed again. He was too far away to know what had triggered her amusement, and he didn't care. Watching her smile was enough. But that changed when a man walked over to her and handed her a cup. She took a sip, said something that elicited a chuckle, and then he put his arm around her before letting it drop. He didn't step away, though. Instead, he stood almost shoulder to shoulder with her. Jealousy frothed Zack's blood. Questions about that chef in Miami still hung between them, a conversation he couldn't seem to broach without stepping into a minefield. He'd assumed based on their almost kiss and everything she'd said about figuring out her next steps that they were over. Had he been wrong? Was the chef still in the picture? Even if he was, how did Zack have the right to question her with his own exit to Atlanta on the horizon? He jammed his gloved hands deeper into his coat pockets. The answers couldn't wait much longer. He felt an urgency to define this thing that had been hanging between them since he'd first laid eyes on her. Now that he knew where she was, he would keep an eye on her, but stay out of her line of sight. If all went according to plan, at least he'd have a gift in hand when he did finally approach her to clear the air. The cheerful din of neighbors gathering and a violinist playing "We Wish You a Merry Christmas" greeted him inside the community hall. About 30 vendors had set out their tables. Each one held a small Christmas tree centerpiece and a wide assortment of handcrafted goods. Sweet and savory aromas drifted through the air. A bright flash drew his attention to the 10-foot-tall tree at the end of the room, where people waited in line to take pictures. "Hey, Doc, good to see you out." Frank Griffith clapped a hand on Zack's shoulder. Frank had been a merchant marine for years before settling down on the island. He had a never-ending store of tales about the different ports he'd seen all over the world. They chatted for a while, and during their conversation, Zack had agreed to go ice fishing with Frank and his 2 sons before Mrs. Griffith's holiday honey-do list got so long he couldn't sneak away. Zack managed a few more steps before Eliza Hayes stopped him to make sure he'd be at the roast beef dinner in the dining room of the community center after the tree lighting. Once she'd wangled a yes out of him, he broke through a small opening in the crowd and stood before a table full of stunning rocks. Hand-painted images of area landmarks covered each one. He liked them and decided to come back if he found nothing else. He strolled past 3 more tables full of quilts, knit items, and books before making his way back toward the entrance. Everything was cute, but nothing really spoke to his heart. His gaze caught on a table beside the main window. He hadn't seen it when he'd walked up to the building or when he'd entered. It was small, though, so maybe that was how he missed it. It held a few Christmas ornaments. "These are great," he said to the gray-haired woman sitting on the other side of the table. "Thank you. Anything strike your fancy, Doc?" she asked, a glint of a smile in her curious eyes. He smoothed a palm over his chin. "Actually, I'm trying to find something that says miracle. You have anything that fits the bill?" Her gaze scanned the assortment on the table. Let's see. Here we go." She handed him an ornament that reminded him of the rocks on the table he'd bookmarked a few minutes earlier. Someone had hand-painted a snow-covered lighthouse next to a lake. The image was framed with glittering white pines. A red puppy sat beneath the branches. The color, the contrast, everything about the scene was cheery. And as he turned it over in his hands, a memory loosened. It was a remembrance of laughter, the rich smell of barbecue on the tiny coal grill his father lugged around on their boat. But most of all, it was a memory of his parents' love. They loved each other, and they loved lighthouses. "Any sailor who's been caught in a storm will tell you a lighthouse is a miracle," the woman said, interrupting his thoughts. It sounded like something his mother used to say. Life was as tumultuous as the sea, but God was good and provided us lighthouses all along the way. They could take any form, and sometimes you had to tilt your head just right to see them, but they were there. Always. He cradled the ornament in his hands. "This looks like it was custom-made for someone I know." The woman pointed to the lighthouse. "It's modeled after the old one on Grand Island." "Really?" It was the same old wooden lighthouse his parents used to love. He gave a startled laugh. "Well, thank you, ma'am. I think we have a winner." There's nothing like the smile on a person's face when they receive a gift they love. The woman tucked the ornament into a gift bag. He couldn't wait to give it to Linda to see her smile. Stepping back into the night, the crisp air greeted him, but didn't penetrate his new scarf or socks. He looked back through the window and waved one more time at the old woman, then turned to the street. Even more people had joined the crowd around the tree. A woman was passing out sheets of paper with Christmas carols on them, and an excited buzz circulated from person to person. The tree would be lit soon, and for the first time, he shared in some of the anticipation. He supposed this might just be the spirit of Christmas. Zack. He turned to face Linda and the man from earlier. Zack eyed him from head to toe. He had dark hair and a square jaw, about the same height and build as Zack. "You remember my brother, Adam?" Linda said, her voice bright. Her brother? Relief filled him. How could he have doubted her? "Adam, sure, good to see you, man." "Thanks, good to see you too. Sis told me you're going to come visit us at the farm soon." "That must have been before I came by yesterday." Was he imagining it, or did she wince at the mention of yesterday? "Oh, I missed you. Guess that means you'll have to come back."